Imagine waking up one morning in paradise. You're surrounded by jungle, green, endless, alive. The air smells like rain and flowers. You've got a community, people who love you, who believe what you believe, who sacrificed everything to be here with you, just like you did. You've escaped America, escaped racism, escaped poverty, escaped the corruption and the cruelty and the loneliness of the modern world. You're in Jonestown. And for a moment, just a moment, it feels like heaven. Now imagine that on November 18th, 1978, an ordinary Saturday morning, your leader's voice crackles through the loudspeakers mounted on every building in camp. He tells you it's time. Not time for breakfast. Not time for the morning prayer meeting. Time to die. What you do next? 918 people decided together, and almost none of them said no. To understand Jonestown, you have to understand Jim Jones. And to understand Jim Jones, you have to understand that monsters rarely look like monsters. James Warren Jones was born in 1931 in Crete, Indiana, a tiny, forgotten town in the middle of nowhere. His father was a bitter, disabled World War I veteran. His mother was eccentric, fiercely independent, not particularly interested in motherhood. Jim Jones grew up largely alone. Neighbors remembered him as strange even as a child, obsessed with death, obsessed with religion. He would conduct mock funerals for animals. He would preach to other kids like a tiny, fire-eyed preacher, commanding, magnetic, impossible to ignore. Already at 10 years old, people did what Jim Jones said. By his 20s, he had found his stage. He became a pastor in Indianapolis, and unlike most white pastors in 1950s America, he did something radical. He opened his doors to black families. He preached racial integration at a time when that could get you killed. He set up soup kitchens. He got addicts off the street. He found the people society had thrown away, and he looked them in the eye and said, "I see you. You matter. And God, through me, loves you." It was beautiful. It was real, at least at first. His congregation grew. His power grew with it. And like many men who accumulate too much power too quickly, Jim Jones began to believe his own myth. He claimed he could heal the sick. He would stage elaborate faith healings, planting people in the audience, producing fake tumors made of chicken liver, declaring miracles. His followers wept. They believed. Because when you're desperate, when life has beaten you down to nothing, and someone offers you a miracle, you want it to be real. By the 1960s and 70s, the People's Temple, as his church was now known, had tens of thousands of members across California. Politicians courted him. Newspapers praised him. He was photographed with mayors, governors, presidential candidates. Jim Jones had become untouchable. But behind closed doors, the man was unraveling. He was addicted to prescription drugs, barbiturates, amphetamines, anything to keep him going and quiet the demons. He was having affairs with multiple members of his congregation, men and women, both, and calling it divine. He was increasingly paranoid, convinced that the government, the CIA, the media, everyone was conspiring to destroy him. And when people tried to leave the People's Temple, they found it wasn't so easy. Former members reported beatings, public humiliations. Members were forced to stand in front of the congregation and confess invented sins while others screamed at them. Children were paddled for minor disobedience. Adults who questioned Jones were labeled traitors and threatened. The People's Temple was no longer a church. It was a cage. By 1977, the walls were closing in on Jim Jones. A magazine called New West was preparing an explosive expose on the People's Temple. Former members had been speaking out about the abuse, the manipulation, the escalating violence behind the church's good guy image. The story was about to go public. Jones made a decision. He would move his flock somewhere the American press couldn't reach them. Somewhere they could build, as he called it, a socialist utopia, a place free from capitalism, racism, and oppression. He chose the jungle of Guyana, a small country on the northern coast of South America. His people had already been cutting a settlement out of the rainforest for 2 years. Now he ordered a mass migration. Over 1,000 people packed their bags, sold their homes, gave away their possessions, and followed Jim Jones into the jungle. They called it Jonestown. He called it the Promised Land. What they found was something else entirely. The settlement was a cluster of wooden buildings, dormitories, a central pavilion, and farmland hacked out of dense jungle. It sat 6 miles from the nearest road and 150 miles from the capital, Georgetown. There was no easy way in. There was no easy way out. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and Jones told his people it was for their protection. From what? From the enemies outside. Jones broadcast his sermons and announcements constantly, through loudspeakers mounted throughout the camp. There was no silence, no escape from his voice. He kept people awake through the night with white nights, sudden emergency drills where everyone was roused from sleep and ordered to gather at the central pavilion. At the earliest white nights, Jones would announce that enemies were coming to destroy them, that the CIA, the American fascists, the racists, they were on their way. The only escape, he said, was revolutionary suicide. He would then have people pass around cups of what he said was poison. The crowd would drink. And then Jones would say, "You see, you are willing to die for the cause. That is beautiful." It was a test. The drink wasn't poison, not yet, but he was training them. Every white night, he was conditioning them to obey without thinking, to drink whatever they were given, to accept death as liberation. The real living conditions in Jonestown were a horror. People were malnourished, surviving on rice and gravy. They worked grueling hours in the tropical heat. Medical care was limited. Children were separated from their parents and placed in communal dormitories. Letters home were censored. And then there was the box. Dissidents, anyone who stepped out of line, anyone who questioned Jones, anyone caught trying to escape, could be placed in the box. It was an underground pit, just large enough to crouch in, filled with darkness and heat. You could be held there for days. And still, people stayed. Not because they were stupid, not because they were weak. They stayed because they had given up everything to be there, because their families were there, because Jim Jones had been carefully, systematically dismantling their ability to trust themselves for years. This is how cults work, not with chains, with love turned into a weapon. By November 1978, families of People's Temple members back in the United States were desperate. They hadn't heard from their loved ones in months. The letters that did arrive were odd, stilted, generic, as if they'd been written by someone else or copied from a template. Phone calls were monitored. Visits were nearly impossible to arrange. A group called the Concerned Relatives had been lobbying Congress for help, and one man listened. Congressman Leo Ryan of California was not a man who sat behind a desk while his constituents suffered. He was known for going undercover. He had once spent time in prison as an inmate just to expose conditions in American jails. He believed in seeing things for himself. He decided to go to Jonestown. On November 14, 1978, Ryan flew to Guyana along with a group of journalists, a few concerned family members, and State Department officials. Jones had not invited them. He had not approved the visit, but he had no way to stop them without revealing what he was trying to hide. The delegation was received at Jonestown on November 17th. What they saw, at first, seemed fine, maybe even impressive. Jones put on a performance: music, dancing, cheerful residents who gave rehearsed speeches about how happy they were. A congressman sat in the central pavilion and watched. But that night, something happened. A note was passed to one of the NBC journalists. It was written on a crumpled piece of paper by a trembling hand. "Please help us get out of Jonestown. It was signed by 2 names. Then another note arrived. Then another. Over the course of the evening, 15 people quietly, desperately, asked to leave with Ryan. Jones watched this happen and understood what it meant. The performance was over. The next morning, November 18th, Ryan's group prepared to leave with the defectors. The atmosphere was tense. Jones looked ill, sweating, shaking, his famous sunglasses barely hiding the wildness in his eyes. Ryan, trying to defuse the situation, actually told Jones the visit had been positive overall. That most people seemed content. But Jones wasn't listening anymore. He had gone somewhere else inside himself. As the group drove to the nearby airstrip at Port Kaituma, one of the supposed defectors, a man named Don Sly, suddenly pulled a knife and tried to cut Leo Ryan's throat. Ryan survived with minor cuts, restrained by others in the group. But it was only the beginning. At the airstrip, as the group boarded 2 small planes, several men arrived in a dump truck. They were Jonestown guards. They carried rifles. They opened fire without warning. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot and killed on the runway. 3 journalists died. One of the defectors was killed. Multiple others were wounded. The planes sat on the airstrip, shot to pieces, going nowhere. Back in the jungle, 6 miles away, Jim Jones had already given his final order. At 5 p.m. on November 18, 1978, the loudspeakers of Jonestown crackled to life. Jim Jones called his people to the central pavilion. Over 1,000 men, women, and children gathered beneath the tin roof. It was hot. It was always hot. Guards stood at the edges. Jones sat in his chair at the front, looking like a man already half gone from the world, pale, hollow, swaying slightly. He began to speak. A recording exists of what happened next. It is called the death tape. You can find it online if you have the stomach for it. 44 minutes of audio that is among the most disturbing documents ever created. Jones told his congregation that the congressman's delegation had been attacked, that the wounded would return to the United States, that the American government would now descend on Jonestown and destroy everything they had built, that they would torture the children, that there was no way out. The only option, Jones said, was revolutionary suicide, to die with dignity, to die together on their own terms as a final act of protest against a world that had never wanted them. A large metal vat was brought out. It contained grape-flavored punch mixed with cyanide, Valium, chloral hydrate, and Phenergan. A lethal cocktail. It was real this time. Medical staff wearing stethoscopes moved through the crowd with syringes and cups. And here is the thing that the world has never fully grappled with. The thing that makes Jonestown not just a tragedy, but a horror that lives in the marrow. Some people screamed. Some people ran. There are voices on the death tape of people begging Jones to reconsider. A woman named Christine Miller stands up and argues with him, eloquently, bravely, saying that the people deserve to live. The crowd shouts her down. Jones dismisses her. Most people, did not run, did not scream, did not fight. They had been rehearsed, conditioned over years of white nights to accept this moment without resistance. Their critical thinking had been slowly, deliberately removed from them. Many of them believed, truly believed, that what Jones was telling them was right. Parents gave the poison to their children first, using syringes to squirt it into babies' mouths, holding their small children and rocking them as the cyanide did its work, quickly, agonizingly, in under 5 minutes. Then the parents drank. Then everyone else. Mothers found with their arms wrapped around their children. Families collapsed together on the ground in clusters, as if they had simply fallen asleep. 918 people died that day. 303 of them were children. Jim Jones was found in his chair, shot through the head. Whether he shot himself or was shot by an aide, no one knows for certain. The coward who had sent over 900 people to their deaths could not face what he had done. The jungle was silent. And then, hours later, Guyanese soldiers arrived, and they found the bodies. When the news broke on November 19, 1978, the world simply couldn't process it. 918 dead. A congressman assassinated on foreign soil. An entire American community, almost entirely black and working class, wiped out in a jungle on the other side of the world. The U.S. military was deployed to recover the bodies. What soldiers found when they arrived at Jonestown was something none of them ever recovered from. The smell hit them before they could see anything. In the tropical heat, the bodies had been decomposing for over 24 hours. They lay in enormous clusters, hundreds of people face down in the mud, arms around each other, as if in an embrace that death had simply interrupted. The colors, the scale, the silence of it. Soldiers described it as something from a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. It took days to remove all the bodies. Back in America, the story landed like a bomb. Up until that point, Jonestown had not been widely known outside of California. To most of the country, the People's Temple was just another fringe religious group. What the news was now reporting seemed impossible. Initial estimates put the death toll at around 400. Government officials assumed the rest had escaped into the jungle. Slowly, horribly, the real number emerged. The bodies had been stacked on top of each other. The full scale of what had happened had been hidden beneath the dead. 918. For a brief, awful period, in November 1978, Jonestown represented the greatest single loss of American civilian life in history. A record it would hold until September 11, 2001. The families who had been desperately seeking their loved ones, who had lobbied Congress, who had pleaded for someone to intervene, now received the news that had no words. Many of those families spent the rest of their lives fighting for recognition that their relatives were victims, not willing participants. Because one of the cruelest legacies of Jonestown is the way it was initially reported, as if the people who died had chosen this, as if they were fanatics who got what they wanted. They were not. They were people who had been hunted down by a monster, who wore the face of a savior. Jonestown left marks on the world that have never fully healed. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered the English language as a way to describe blind, unthinking obedience, though this is in itself a cruelty to the dead. They weren't fools who blindly followed. They were people who had been systematically broken down and rebuilt to serve one man's ego and terror. Jonestown rewrote how the world understood cults. Before 1978, cult was a word without real teeth. After Jonestown, law enforcement, psychologists, governments, everyone had to reckon with the reality of what a sufficiently powerful, sufficiently charismatic abuser could do when given enough followers and enough isolation. The lessons were learned, imperfectly, slowly, but they were learned. When the Branch Davidians barricaded themselves in Waco, Texas, in 1993, investigators referenced Jonestown. When Heaven's Gate members killed themselves in 1997, waiting for a spaceship behind the Hale-Bopp comet, people referenced Jonestown. Every time a charismatic leader demands absolute loyalty, demands that followers cut ties with their families, demands that they prove their devotion by giving up something irreplaceable, the ghost of Jim Jones is in that room. There are survivors of Jonestown, people who weren't there that day, who were in Georgetown, or who had managed to leave before the end. They have spent their lives carrying something most of us can barely imagine: the knowledge that their community, their family, their world was erased in a single afternoon. Some of them speak. Some of them don't. Some of them are still trying to explain to people that the person they loved wasn't a fool. That love is not stupidity. That the desire to belong, to be seen, to build something meaningful, these are not weaknesses. These are the most human things there are. Jim Jones knew that. He used it as a weapon. If this story affected you, please share it. Not because of us. Because the 303 children who died in that clearing deserve to be more than a punchline about Kool-Aid. This has been Forgotten Horrors.